Welcome back to episode 2 of the Savvy Skeptic Psychedelic Forum. So, this episode is called What We Talk About When We Talk About Psychedelics. And I thought, Rakesh, for today's episode, we could briefly review terminology because the term psychedelics can sometimes be used very loosely. So, the articles that we'll be reviewing today, one is a very thorough review on the topic by David Nichols from 2016, and then a much more recent review by Kelmendi et al., which has some really nice illustrations. But first, Rakesh, I wanted to ask you, could you speak a little bit about what the term psychedelic means and how it arose?
What a beautiful term, right? Psychedelic, which pretty much translates into mind manifesting. And what an amazing putting together of two terms that are incredibly accurate, Katya. And this term arose from a conversation between two people who were both very interested in psychedelics. And it was a psychiatrist. It was a British psychiatrist who just jokingly wrote to his friend, also a British writer, and put out this term as they were going back and forth what to call these drugs. Because initially they thought it was a psychotomimetic drug, and it was clearly not behaving that way. So they proposed the term psychedelic. This was back in the 40s, but not until 1957 was this term actually formally for the first time presented at a New York State scientific meeting, and immediately caught the attention of the world because the term precisely describes what these drugs do, Katya. They really are mind manifesting. And that is the origin of the term psychedelic.
So that's fascinating. And these substances that we think of as psychedelic, in some cases also as psychoactive, in the sense of revealing the mind or affecting the mind in a profound way, they differ from each other in their chemical structure, their mechanism of action, and their effect on the user. The psychedelics that people naturally think of and know best include naturally occurring psilocybin, of course, synthesized LSD, and ayahuasca, which is a mixture. It contains DMT, which is a powerful hallucinogenic, which is not active orally, but in ayahuasca is present with the pounded bark of the Banisteriopsis caapi vines, which contain beta alkaloids, which inhibit the liver MAOA enzyme that breaks down DMT, and it makes it possible for it to be taken as a tea and makes it orally active in this combination. So these are the best known examples.
This is true, Katya. These are some of the terms that have almost become adjectives and nouns. I mean, psychedelics are very much in the conversation. So the term psychoactive pretty much applies to anything that works on the brain, which could be anything. I mean, even pain medications could be thought of as psychoactive. But when we talk about psychedelic, we mean something entirely different. And that's why I am particularly glad you are focusing this episode on terminology. That's actually a big deal. It's hard to become an expert in an area if actually we don't know what the term means. So most typical psychedelics, and you gave some examples, are tryptamine analogs. So that definitely includes psilocybin and DMT. By the way, that would be the active ingredient in ayahuasca. These are the classics, if you will. Now, LSD is a synthetic ergoline, but that naturally comes from ergots, from fungus. And famously, the origin of LSD was from ergots, as researchers were in fact looking for a medication to improve blood pressure. That's what they were looking for, and just inadvertently happened to create LSD. But there is a completely different class of medications called phenylethylamines, of which mescaline is a group member. And then finally, we have what we often call dissociatives, Katya. And that's probably not the best term, but right now the medical community is calling them dissociative or deliriants. And here we have a couple of examples. We have datura, and we, of course, famously have ketamine. But it is really important to appreciate these molecules are not just structurally different, they're mechanistically quite different. And from the perspective of someone receiving these, the effects can be quite dramatically different.
So that's a great explanation. I think that's very helpful. One thing I noticed in the Nichols paper is, just as a little aside, the fact that the synthesis of LSD by Hoffman was followed very closely in time with the identification, discovery really of the serotonin receptor, and then really an explosion of research on serotonin. So I find it ironic and interesting, or maybe just apt, that we are coming back to it in psychiatry now, but really a lot of the early progress in psychiatry is in some way owed to the discoveries about serotonin that came about because of the discovery of LSD.
Katya, what you just said needs to be underlined. And psychiatry should remember that psychedelics are not a new class of drugs at all. They, in fact, are older than almost everything we use in modern day psychiatry. So, yeah, serotonin discovery owes a lot to LSD and then followed by psilocybin. And your point is very well made. And it's really important to remember that tryptamines actually structurally resemble serotonin. So there's something about these molecules that exist in nature.
Mhm.
Psilocybin is, of course, millions of years older than Homo sapiens. And one has to wonder, why does it exist in nature? But beyond that philosophical question, we may want to come back to biochemistry and recognize that psilocybin in particular, but also LSD in many ways, does quite a bit resemble serotonin in the human brain. And that's why probably it fits quite nicely into the lock being the various serotonin receptors. And there's a huge number of them. But the one that psychedelics really seem to have a preference for is 5-HT2A. And it's this 5-HT2A receptor agonism that these classic drugs have, Katya, is what makes them mind manifesting or a psychedelic. But really, maybe we can talk a bit more about the other classes of drugs. So besides the 5-HT2A drugs, I think it'd be important to recognize that MDMA, which probably is going to be the first medication intervention that will be available to the American population and clinicians, is actually mechanistically very different. Many of us don't even think of it as a psychedelic. On some days I do, Katya, some days I don't. But the truth is, it truly is mind manifesting, but it's not often called a psychedelic. It's called an empathogen, something that you and I will be discussing momentarily. And then there is, of course, mescaline, probably one of the oldest human use psychoactive drugs ever. But the mechanism of action is actually quite different. It's a partial agonist at 5-HT2A receptor, but it also binds to other members of the serotonergic family, in particular 2C and dopamine receptors. And clients of mine who have used mescaline before and who have used psilocybin before and who have used MDMA, LSD before, report distinctly different effects and different side effects. So it's not just us as scientists and clinicians who should be interested in these various classes. There actually, in fact, are considerable differences between these various drugs that we lump into the psychedelic bucket.
I think this distinction is really important. And in the same way that the tryptamines resemble serotonin, mescaline really resembles amphetamine, right? Chemically speaking.
It does.
Yeah.
And so does MDMA. MDMA
Yeah.
structurally sits so close to amphetamines that early researchers were actually confused by it, which is probably the reason why for decades it was left on the shelf. And it took a good 50 years after the compound was created before there was first real human use of it as a psychedelic.
And MDMA also works by blocking the serotonin transporter, right? So it vastly increases the amount of serotonin in the synapse. So in a way, it's like a super SSRI.
It is. But I gotta say, the more I study MDMA, the more stunned I am as to what it does. So there's no question it increases the synaptic availability of serotonin, but it's also norepinephrine.
Mhm.
It's also oxytocin. It's also prolactin. It's also cortisol. There's not an SSR in the world that would even dare to touch any of these other receptors. It also works on the VMAT transporter that lives in the presynaptic neuron. So MDMA really ought to be thought of as a drug in its own class. And we have simply no other analogs at the moment that can do what it does. And I would hate for our colleagues to think about MDMA as only a serotonergic drug. It is, but it is so profoundly more than that, that it does seem that the major empathogenic effects of it, that I know we'll be talking about in a minute, probably don't just from the serotonin. They probably are derived from this complex soup and mixture of neurotransmitters and substances this compound acutely elevates.
So that's very exciting. It's truly multimodal. Yeah.
I think it gives a multimodal a true face. It is so multimodal. Every time I scratch under the surface or dig a bit deeper, I am astonished to find as to how many different things MDMA can do.
Well, that's fascinating. And of course, ketamine is often spoken of in the same breath as the typical psychedelics we talked about, but it's very different. It's a dissociative anesthetic, and it's actually an NMDA receptor agonist, and it's an enantiomer. Esketamine has already been approved for treatment-resistant depression and depression with suicidal ideation. So it's already being used, and my understanding is it's extremely effective. And then mucimol and its prodrug ibotenic acid are derived from the iconic Amanita muscaria mushrooms, which I saw in the forest in my childhood in Russia. And these substances are potent GABA A agonists. So GABA is also involved. So just to summarize, I would say that although the prototypical psychedelics that we think of work through 5-HT2A agonism or partial agonism, there's also other substances that they interact with, such as dopamine, glutamate, or GABA. And we'll see in a little bit more detail when we talk about mechanism in future episodes that these neurotransmitter systems are actually intricately linked to each other. But let's turn now to maybe talk about the most intuitive way to classify these substances by their effect on the user. Can you talk a little bit about that, please, Rakesh?
Yes, Katya, and so glad you gave us a scholarly review of these various mechanisms of action that belong to the large category that we call psychedelic compounds. And isn't ketamine interesting? It was invented as an analog of PCP, PCP, that dreaded PCP. The goal was to make it a better PCP, so that patients don't have so many side effects. And now it's turned out to be America's only truly legal psychedelic. And I'm here to testify that even though we tend to call it a dissociative, which by the way is true, it dissociates you while you're fully awake from a painful event that's happening to you. For example, if you have a cut or a broken bone. I really think it's important we, who are scientifically oriented, not just accepted at face value. There's something about NMD antagonism when you utilize it to help a patient in the right context, set and setting, is as powerful a psychedelic as psilocybin or MDMA. But putting that to the side, maybe the terminology needs to be talked about. We do have the classic psychedelics, and America is going to be re-encountering them. Psilocybin, Katya, as you know, is lined up quite nicely to be the next one approved. LSD is being studied in rigorous trials for a variety of indications. But the one we should talk about, of course, is MDMA. And the term most often used to describe it is an entheogen. What a fascinating term. Psychiatry decided to put aside spirituality and religious connections aside when we modernized, quote unquote. But these drugs, particularly MDMA, are often called appropriately entheogens or empathogens. And let's spend a minute talking about those terms because our colleagues will most likely encounter them as they read the literature. So entheogen literally means a reconnection or a deeper connection to spirituality and or there's two different things, and or religious beliefs. A lot of my patients talk a lot about meeting God or having a feeling about spirituality in a way that they didn't even think lived inside them. And they give credit to these compounds as dramatically altering their view about spirituality, perhaps about their connection to life, perhaps to afterlife, what kind of life they would have. Now, empathogen is different, Katya.
Mhm.
You can have both in entheogenic and empathogenic experience, but empathogenic literally means a reconnection to your emotional life. And these individuals often report a profound improvement in emotional communication, either with themselves or with their families and their friends. So the feelings they report are of oneness, of relatedness, of emotional empathy, not just for living beings, but interestingly, sometimes for non living entities as well. And then there's the final term we should talk about, which is called intactogens, which again is quite different. This is not a deeper connection with the world outside. Intactogen, touching yourself. So the literal translation of that would be a substance that promotes the reaching inside to retrieve either repressed positive memories or repressed negative memories. And when you put all of this together from a scientific perspective, we are able to detect with these drugs, Katya, things such as improved social behavior or a dramatically enhanced state of introspection that's almost always positive and healing and leads to wellness. And therein lies the reason why these terms, empathogen, ectatogens, are really important in psychiatry.
Well, thank you for giving a masterclass in these terms. I think that people have heard them thrown around, but it's really important to understand them. So that's great. I'm personally really intrigued by the idea of an entheogen, so substance that can create or reconnect you to spiritual experience in the brain. Personally, I grew up without religion, but having very intense spiritual experiences that because of my neurologist father, I just assumed were coming from my brain. And it wasn't until, I was an adult that I started thinking about the neuroscience behind it. But, spiritual feelings are so ubiquitous across societies. I think that even though psychiatry and neuroscience threw them away, so to speak, for a long time, any scientist who's interested in observing reality has to be compelled by the fact that they're ubiquitous. And the connection to brain mechanisms is particularly fascinating. Wouldn't it be great if in upcoming episodes we actually talked about what the experience is like for the person who's taking the psychedelic journey in some detail?
I think
Then
that would be amazing.
I think we should focus on that. And then future episodes, we can also talk about the mechanism of action in more detail.
We definitely should do that. And you have really made me think about this issue in a deeper way. And Johns Hopkins, one of the earliest studies they did, as you know, was actually giving psychedelics, particularly psilocybin, to people of the cloth.
Mhm.
These were people who were deeply religious to the point that they had turned their life over to serving God, their faith, their religion, and the people who followed them. And it was amazing. Even in these, what I would consider deeply spiritual, religious individuals, one or two exposures to psychedelics dramatically deepened their connection in very meaningful ways. So there's something happening here, right? And that something is probably a combination of the biological event, those receptors being occupied, whatever they are, depending on the drug. But the question is, how does that affect a person's belief in the unknown or the connection with what they call God or what they call religion, or with what we found in our own research, Katya, is a deep connection to Earth and to nature.
Yes.
What exactly is happening here? And I very much look forward to the future episodes where we would cover such issues.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Rakesh, and thank you to our listeners for joining us today for episode 2.
Thank you.